Uh, and believe and believe me, you will need this as you go through your time. So this evening's speaker is Gail Uday. I hope I said that right, Gail.
Good enough.
Good. Gail has over 25 years experience in organizational leadership and is a seasoned coach, trainer, and mediator. Gail has designed and facilitated numerous courses on harassment in the workplace, conflict management, and problem solving. Gail specializes in working with individuals in high intensity situations, including workplace harassment. So, without further ado, I now give you Gail Uday.
Thanks so much, John. So good to be here with you this evening. Believe it or not, I'm actually in your district as we speak. I had work today in Toronto, so I'm in an Airbnb in Toronto right now. So actually in your district. And I see a few familiar faces here, but a lot of new faces as well. So glad to connect with you this way and to get to know you a little bit. John told you about my professional bio in terms of Rotary. I come from District 7040, right beside you. I live in Ottawa usually, and am the district trainer in that district, just about to finish my term, so just finishing with that role, and am the program chair for this year's district conference here as well. So and I'm part of the Orleans Club on the east end of Ottawa. I'd like to just get a quick sense of who we've got in the room, and if you've got access to your reactions, and or if you just want to raise your hand, I'd like to know how many people on here are repeat presidents. Is this more than your very first term? How many do we have that are repeaters? So few. Now I don't know that
six.
About six. Okay.
Yeah, I think I saw six.
And the rest are first timers. And so John said you're going to need this to hear about conflict management, conflict resolution. I don't want to scare presidents, new presidents coming in. You're supposed to come into your role with a lot of enthusiasm and optimism and excitement. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, you're going to need this, because guess what? It doesn't matter. Even in great organizations like Rotary, conflict happens. Doesn't always have to be huge, doesn't always have to be horrible and messy, but conflict does happen. And so the more we know about it, the better prepared we are, the better for all of us, and the more likely you'll have a really good year as your club president. So I'm really glad to be here to talk with you about it. And I invite you at any point, by all means, post questions in the chat, so that as we go along, this can be the most valuable to you as possible. Now I'm going to share my screen and my slides. So give me just a second here, and I'll do that from the beginning. Are you seeing my slides? I see a nod. Okay, great. So you'll see I've entitled the session "When Good People Disagree: Dealing with Conflict in Rotary," because what is sometimes unique, or one thing to remember about conflict in Rotary, is that just because we disagree about things doesn't make us bad people, or doesn't make one person a bad person, or anything like that. Conflict happens, disagreements happen, and part of what makes it difficult to deal with in Rotary sometimes is that we're all just really good people trying to do good things. And so it sometimes makes it a little tricky dealing with the conflict. So in this hour and a half that we have, I want to talk about some insights into why and how conflict happens, and using Rotary specific, but you know, the principles are the same. And the reason why it's important to talk about why and how it happens is that that often will give us the insight as to what to do about the conflict, because not all conflicts are created equally. Not all of them have the same lifespan, not the same impact on people, all of those things. So depending on what kind of conflict we have, how far it's escalated, all of those things, it makes a difference as to what's the best approach to resolve it. So it's important to have some of that knowledge. The other thing that I often say is, you know, if I were to use an image or a metaphor as to what I think conflict often looks like for people, I often think of that really messy, complicated ball of yarn or ball of string, you know, where you're trying to unravel it and get it all straightened out, and it seems next to impossible because it's full of knots and it's all intertwined, and it gets really messy, and you start looking at it and you go, this is just impossible. This isn't going to work. Well, understanding some of these pieces of how conflict works is what allows us to understand then how to start unraveling, how to start straightening it out so that it doesn't seem so impossible to deal with and so difficult and so messy. So we'll talk about that. And then I want to give you some tips, some things to remember, some things to think about when it comes to your role in intervening. And you know, yep, you're coming in as club presidents, and that's a super important role. And a lot of people will be looking to you for leadership. And so they might expect you to resolve all the problems that exist in your club as well. And so I'll give you some tips there. And if we have time, and depending a little bit on where your questions are, I've got a couple of case studies to look at, things that have happened in Rotary before that might look a little familiar to you. And we can look at those and get some highlights and apply some of this knowledge to those case studies. Alternately, if you've got questions along the way and that would be more helpful to you to simply look at some of those questions, happy to do that as well. So we'll kind of judge our time towards the end and what makes the most sense. So I hope that feels okay to you. That's where we're going. Nope. I'm not sure why it won't move. There we go. So again, I'd like to just invite you to share in the chat and put something in there. What do you think causes conflict in clubs? How does that happen? And there isn't a right answer here. There isn't a single answer. There's all kinds of things that can cause conflict. So thank you. Yeah, so change causes conflict. Yep, simple misunderstanding. Absolutely. What else causes conflict, folks? Anything. Egos. Yeah. We got some type A personalities in Rotary, don't we? Yep. Lack of communication or miscommunication, right? We think that that we're speaking well, and sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Differences of opinion, competing visions. Absolutely. What else? Anybody got some others? Different values. Yeah. Sometimes people think the club should be doing different things, or should have different priorities or different expectations. Not listening. Absolutely. Bad manners. I love it. Yes. Just sometimes we behave badly, right? And people are not really thinking about the consequences of their behavior or the impact it has on others. Yep. Different generational perspectives. Absolutely. Misunderstanding of Rotary's goals. Absolutely. I think the list could go on. The longer I gave you to think about it, the more things that you would come up with as to what causes conflict in our clubs. But absolutely, those are all a part of it, and then some. There are more. So the interesting thing about those conflicts is they're not all created equal. They are not all the same kind of conflict. We call them different conflict zones. They come in from different places. And what that means is that depending on what kind of conflict you have, you may need to deal with it differently. So for example, and some of you said, like, people just have different values, or they think about things differently. Sometimes just the sheer fact that people are different causes conflict, right? I belong to a morning club and a breakfast club, and we meet at 7 a.m. And I have to admit that I am not a morning person, and not everybody in that club is a morning person. It still makes the most sense for me to be a part of that club, and so on Wednesdays I get up early and I join my club. But I can honestly admit I'm probably not always at my best at 7 a.m. I can guarantee you that some other people in my club are not at their best at 7 a.m. And simply by the virtue of us not all being morning people, we are not always as careful with our words as we should be. We have little clashes, little things that happen just because we're different people. And, and then those people who, at 7 o'clock, they're already, a third of the way through their day. They've been up since 5. They've gotten all kinds of things done already before they come for Rotary. Where they're at in their day, a totally different thing. And they're much more awake, and they're, much more raring to go. And it can cause those little irritations. So even those little things, I would call that a personality thing. Like, it's, we're just different people. But personalities is not all of conflict. So you see there in front of you 5 different zones of conflict, or types of conflict. So let me explain. You've got on the one side perceptual conflict. Somebody said that conflict is caused by misunderstanding, and that's exactly what a perceptual conflict is. It's pure and simple, a misunderstanding. In other words, what I said or did was intended one way, and how it was received, the impact it had, was not what I intended. And so that misunderstanding can happen by virtue of the words I chose. And I said it one way, used a particular turn of phrase or word, and it didn't have the same connotations for you. It can also be more significant than that in terms of a misunderstanding. But the long and short of it is that, as I said, at the heart, it's that whatever I intended to convey by my words or actions is not the way it was received. Okay, that's a perceptual conflict. A positional conflict, you see there beside it, different in the sense that a positional conflict is not a misunderstanding. We understand each other perfectly, but we simply disagree on how to do things, or what's right or what's wrong. It can be as simple as, I come from Ottawa, so I cheer for the Ottawa Senators, and you're from Toronto, so you cheer for the Maple Leafs. We disagree on which hockey team we should be cheering for. That's positional. We don't misunderstand each other. You don't misunderstand my loyalty to the Senators, but we just disagree. It can also be positional. One of the things that you shared was a misunderstanding about Rotary's, policies or Rotary's priorities. But sometimes we disagree on what the policies mean. In other words, we've always said the four-way test at the beginning of every meeting. That's what you do in Rotary. You always do that. And then the new president comes in and says, don't know if I want to say do the four-way test every single meeting. I think we're going to change it up a little bit. And somebody says, no, that's not Rotary. That's not what we do in Rotary. Right? It's not a misunderstanding. You understand each other perfectly, but you simply disagree on how this meeting should be run. That's positional conflict. Relational conflict is that conflict that is about different people. So it can be about morning people and not morning people. It can be about people that are high energy, high enthusiasm, and those people who are a little bit more cautious and careful. It can be about people who are ready to jump in to everything and anything and say, this is what we got to do and this is how we got to do it, and they're ready to roll. And those people who say, think we need to think about this, we need to weigh the pros and cons, we really need to decide if this is how we want to move forward. Again, different ways of approaching things, just by virtue of us being different people. This is also where things like generational differences can fit in, because those are relational issues too. And the fact of the matter is, doesn't mean or it doesn't matter how good you are at understanding another generation, they are different, right? Those of us who are at the end of the baby boomers are different than the millennials and the Gen X's, and on it goes. There's a reason why each of those generations has a different name, because they are slightly different, and their priorities and their way of thinking and their way of approaching the world is slightly different. I know in Rotary, for example, we do a lot of emphasis on, we want more young people to come into Rotary. We want young people to be engaged in Rotary. And I don't disagree. I think young people bring a great opportunity to Rotary. But I also know that if you are a young person, think back to when you were in your 20s, some of you are still there. But for some of you where that's a while ago, think about how you at that point really were focusing on your career, or you suddenly had to move because you got transferred somewhere else, or you were starting a family. And so your time often was consumed by the requirements of raising a family, right? Really different priorities at that point, and ability to make time commitments than when you're retired, or when you own your own business at 50, or something like that. And so that sheer fact that different generations have different priorities and different, life circumstances causes conflict. Frequently a 20-something-year-old in your club cannot contribute as much time or as much money as some of the older folks in the club. Does that make them bad Rotarians? Not in my books. I don't think that makes them bad Rotarians, but I do know that it is hard in some clubs for them to see that and go, okay, but then they're not pulling their weight. They should be doing more. They should be on more committees. They should be taking more responsibility. And consequently, they then start to feel like Rotary is not the place for them. So those are all relational issues. Structural conflict, structural conflict is about the way things are set up, the way that they're organized, and that causes conflict as well. And as much as we say there are no Rotary police, and there aren't, there's no one that's going to come and arrest you for doing things differently. But there are certain expectations that Rotary International has. Absolutely. Why do you go to a president-elect training? Because there are certain things that, this is how Rotary operates, that you need to learn. You need to be responsible and accountable for a budget. You need to have bylaws, and you need to follow a constitution. All of these things are the structure of Rotary. And sometimes they cause conflict. So I'll give you a quick example that I know about. And this is just one example of a structural conflict. So I know a club in my district who started a satellite club. Okay, so again, it's one great way of starting a new club. They started a satellite club. And that satellite club kept staying just under the numbers that Rotary International required for it to become an official club on its own. And it stayed there, and it stayed there, and it stayed there. And the club itself, the satellite club, kept saying, we want to be an independent club. We don't want to be ruled, influenced, overseen by this larger club. And the larger club was feeling the same way. It's time to send the child on its way and get it on its own 2 feet. But structurally, Rotary International has its rules about when a club can become a club. And those rules got frustrating on both sides for these 2 clubs. And it caused a lot of strife between the satellite club and the initial larger club that started it. So that's just one example of a structural issue that can happen in Rotary. And then systemic conflict is the kind of conflict that comes out of bigger, larger issues that are beyond the organization itself, but that impact the organization. So, it's things like economy that impacts what happens in Rotary and can cause conflict in the end, because the economy tanks, people don't donate as much to Rotary, foundation can't give out as much grant money, people get really jealous for their projects, and they start saying, why did that one get money and mine didn't get money, and how come and it can cause conflict. So those are bigger systemic issues. Another one that Rotary is dealing with right now comes out of the whole area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know that this is a big push for Rotary right now, right? DEI, huge push, very important. And Rotary International has stated its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, last year, Nabil Ode, who's my husband, was a president's rep for a district conference. I will not say where, but I will say somewhere in the United States. And we went to that district conference, and it was fascinating to hear them talk about their concern about DEI. Now, here in Canada, your district is all Canadian, right? 7070 is all Canadian, right? 7040 has some districts or some clubs in the States in its district, so it's binational. But regardless, in our districts that are primarily Canadian, when we have talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, and I don't know how it is in your district, but in our district, a lot of the talk about diversity, equity, inclusion is centered around First Nations, incorporates some of, in the States, some of the racism against African Americans, things like that. But that's sort of where DEI has focused. At this particular district conference, when people expressed their concern about DEI, It was all about sexual preferences. For them, it was their concern that if they said Rotary is for all people, and then one person said this, and like I'm practically quoting them word for word, all these trans people are going to show up at our club. And their concern was transgender. And it was just interesting to me, you know, and I said to Nabil afterwards, it's interesting in our district, that's not really been the conversation around DEI. That's not what we've looked at. In that district, it was. And it was causing a great deal of conflict for them, how they chose to interpret it. In other areas of Rotary, in other nations, how they interpret DEI and what that means, they're still talking about women in Rotary. And should they really have women in Rotary? So it means different things to different people. And by the sheer nature that Rotary International has said, we need to talk about this larger systemic issue and need to be an inclusive organization, it impacts the organization. And different people have different opinions about that systemic issue. And so it causes conflict. So those are the five, and I hope that I've been able to make myself clear about those differences. Now, the reason why it's important, as I said, to know what kind of conflict you're dealing with is to know what to do about it. Because if I'm going to treat everything like a perceptual conflict, like a misunderstanding, and just try to clarify what's going on, I'm in fact going to make some of those conflicts worse instead of better. Because if it's something that's systemic or structural, it doesn't just get resolved by clarifying. However, that is the key for dealing with a perceptual conflict. So, as I said, perceptual misunderstanding, what I meant is not what was received, not the impact of my actions or my words. So then I need to clarify. I'm sorry, this is what I meant. This was my intention. And if that is then understood, we clarify, we are able to resolve the conflict. With positional conflict, you don't always resolve it. Sometimes with positional conflict, you just agree to disagree. So, you know, we don't have to come up with one best hockey team if I think it's the Senators and you think it's the Maple Leafs. It's okay. We can agree to disagree on that one. And so some things are like that with positional conflict. They don't have to be resolved. In other cases, however, a positional conflict might be resolved by finding middle ground. So, you know, you think the answer is 5. I think the answer is 3. We say, we'll go with 4 and it's good enough. Let's move on. Find middle ground. In other cases, we might say, oh, you think it's 5. I think it's 3. Well, let's do 5 this time. We'll do 3 next time. That way we can move on. So give in one way, give in the other way, another time, it's all good. So that can be either way. Okay, any of those things are possible with positional conflict. With relational conflict, when we have conflict just because we're different kind of people, a lot of times we have to discuss and work out what kind of relationship we actually want to have. And so, for example, I was asked to come in and work with a club that was having some significant conflict. And it was in large part a relational. It had to do with some strong personalities in the club and their determination to have things go different ways. And when we sat down and talked about it and tried to work it out, the majority of our discussion was, how is it that we want to relate in this club as Rotarians? How do we want to operate? How do we want to show respect for each other? How do we want to listen to each other? And as they discussed that, they were able to get past some of those other differences and work through them. But a relational conflict requires a new understanding of what kind of relationship you want to have. Structural conflict is addressed by addressing the conflict. Changing or addressing the structure that's causing the conflict. So if some policies or procedures are getting in the way and causing a problem, the only way to fix that conflict is to change the structure, change the policy. Now, the problem with that is as soon as you change structure, it might resolve one structural problem, it might start another structural issue. So you have to be aware of that and recognize and say, okay, well, which structural problem is better or worse to live with, and recognize whether you want to actually change that structure or not. And then systemic conflicts are often those conflicts that in fact you can't resolve. So for example, I was talking about DEI, and Rotary has instituted this commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Does that mean that it will eliminate racism in the world? Not anytime soon, that's for sure. Racism is a reality and it exists. Will we be able to impact in a positive way how racism shows up, or especially in Rotary? Can we limit its negative impact by our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion? I believe that we can. I think that it makes a difference. But will it fix everything? Will it resolve everything? Probably not. So with systemic conflict, a lot of times we have to look at how do we live with it? So having said that, and having talked about these 5 different kinds of conflict, I invite you to think about in your club, if you have ever experienced conflict before, or maybe you know of another club that has experienced conflict before, what kind of conflict are they or have they experienced? Was it more structural? Was it more perceptual? Was it relational? Was it more positional? Where did it sit in all of those? And that will then give you the clue as to where and how you can approach the situation. Okay, going to move on to another key point about conflict, and that is about how conflict escalates. Now, every conflict has a life of its own. Every conflict will be just a little bit different and a little bit unique, but there is a pattern to how it escalates. So I'm gonna just because you're top of my screen here, John Burns, I'm gonna pick on you, okay? And let's say John and I disagree. We have a conflict. But it's about not important right now, but we have a disagreement. At its initial stage, as that conflict begins, it's actually a productive thing, because it means that something's rubbing here. We call conflict at its core, it's just a difference, right? It's just a difference. We have a difference of opinion or a difference of expectation or whatever it is, but it's just a difference. And that difference can be really productive, because it can mean that we can result in greater understanding. We can get to know each other better. We can create something new and different. Who knows what can come out of that little difference? It's like that grain of sand that can become a pearl. It can become really productive. So it can be a really good thing. However, more frequently, it doesn't quickly become that pearl. And what happens is, whatever John did or said kind of irritates me, and whatever I did or said kind of irritates him. And it doesn't take too long, and somebody says, Gail, what's going on there? What's the problem? I'll go, I'll tell you what's the problem. John's the problem, right? And I very quickly lost my focus on that original issue, and now I'm focused on that person I have the issue with. And as soon as I do that, as soon as I move my focus off the issue onto the person, it's become a personalized conflict. Because now, like I said, what's the issue about? The issue's about John, as far as I'm concerned. And if you asked him, he'd say the issue's about Gail. And it would become personal. And as it continues to spiral, what happens is what I call issue proliferation. It spreads. Okay, my diagram here is nice and neat. It's actually not that neat and tidy, because what happens is now you see, I've told you that John's the problem. Well, let me tell you, last week when I had such and so an interaction with John, I'll set a problem with him then. Told you, he's a problem. He's so stubborn, or he's always whatever my issue is. In fact, next year, see, I see the DGE there, John. Next year, when he becomes the district governor, let me tell you what's going to happen then. Because if I've got these problems now, guarantee you, down the road, we're going to see this and that, right? And so now I don't just have one issue. I've got this one and this one and this one, and I've got all these examples of why it's all about this other person. And it comes right back at me, right? John is likely to have exactly the same thing happening in this direction. It's not about this one interaction he's had with me, but it's about this, and it's about this, and what about this time? And somebody else told me about another time, and now it's about a whole bunch of things. Well, do you think I'm just talking to myself when I'm talking about all these issues about John? Of course not. I got to tell some other folks, because I got to let them know what my issues with John are. I can't just sit there and talk about it with myself. And so I start getting other people involved. And, I might say, just you need to know what a problem this guy is. Or he might need, just want to warn you about working with Gail. Here's the issue, right? So all with the best of intent, but I want to go out there and start getting other people to hear about what's going on with John as well. And as soon as I start getting those other people involved and building my camp, and John is building his camp, we're moving it up into hostile stage. Because what starts to happen is I'm watching, and if something happens over there, if John does this or that, oh, okay, if he's going to be that way, well, then I'm going to do this. So in Rotary, what I've seen happen in clubs, somebody you don't like, having an issue with, they've said they're going to take charge of that fundraiser. I think I'll set up a different fundraiser. They want to chair that committee, be on the board. Who else is going to be on the board? I better be on the board too, because I don't want them to get something and have something more influence than I have, right? You get this little tit for tat thing going. And I've had some people tell me before, well, that's not such a bad thing. If you've got people volunteering to be on the board or volunteering to set up fundraisers, that's not such a bad thing, right? Well, the only problem is if it's totally competitive and it's just to show up the other person, so to get one over on them, it doesn't usually end too well. And it's not really about their commitment to Rotary anymore. So that kind of thing can happen. Now, I can say in my own personal experience with Rotary, I have never seen a conflict become a physically violent conflict. In my work life, I have. I've seen conflicts become physical. Haven't seen it in Rotary, but if it were to become physical, in other words, punching each other out, beating each other up, whatever the case may be, it happens at that hostile stage. And again, that's that whole, you hit me, I'm going to hit you back kind of tit for tat thing. That's what's happening at that hostile stage. And over time, as that continues, it eventually becomes totally polarized in that John's got his camp of people that agree with him. I've got my camp of people that agree with me, and we will have nothing to do with each other. Totally polarized. This is when you hear people saying, I'm leaving that club. Don't have any use for that particular club anymore. Don't want to be a part of it. Sometimes you have them leave Rotary altogether because of the conflict having come to the polarized stage. You certainly don't have people working together at that stage. So that's where it heads finally. Now, some conflicts will go through that escalation process really quick. It can go from productive to polarized in a flash sometimes. More often, however, it moves slowly through those stages. It may stay at that personalized stage and just these people don't get along. It could stay at that for a long, long time. But I guarantee you, left unaddressed, it will find its way eventually to hostile and eventually polarized conflict. Might take a while, but it will get there. And so, again, important to know what kind of conflict you're dealing with. So you as presidents, and maybe some of you are already well trained and well versed in dealing with conflicts, and you're exceptionally good communicators and mediators, and so you might be totally game and totally qualified to deal with some of these more significant conflicts. But for most folks that are coming in as presidents of clubs, I would suggest to you that it will still be very doable for you to get in and intervene if a conflict has moved to the personalized stage. You as a club president, you can go in there and say, hey guys, I think we need to sit down and talk about this and work this out. Let's just, let's hash out the issues and figure out what's going on here and deal with it. But as it moves to hostile and polarized, remember I talked to you about that issue proliferation, that suddenly there's all kinds of other things and there's other people that have gotten involved. Once it's moved to that stage, it can be really complicated and messy to resolve. And so it's not always doable for a club president to deal with that on their own. That's when you might want to ask for some help. And there is help available. I think in your district, you have a conflict resolution team, do you not? Yeah. So these are the people that you can call on and ask for help. Sometimes it might just be advice. Sometimes it might be helping actually jumping in and intervening. And if there is something that even then is beyond them, they have resources outside the district as well to help them. So it is certainly possible to get that kind of help. And as I said, I've been called upon, Nabil, my husband's been called upon to help with different clubs and districts, as a matter of fact, with some of these issues. So it does happen at times, and there is nothing wrong with saying, I think this is beyond me as a club president, and I may need some other eyes or some other intervention in and helping me address this issue. But at the same time, don't want you to feel scared of jumping in, especially at that personalized stage. If you see that people are really rubbing each other the wrong way, it truly is something that you can kind of nip in the bud before it gets any further. All right. So another thing to talk about is that we all deal with conflict differently. We are not all the same when it comes to conflict. And we love to talk about the birds and the fact that we all have a different style when it comes to dealing with conflict. So I'm going to talk about each one of these. As I'm doing so, think about where you think you fit. What are you most likely to do? And I also invite you to think about your club that you are about to be president of. And what do you think you got the most of in your club? So let me explain. When it comes to conflict, you'll notice on the left, vertically, on that focus there, it says focus on self. And so the low focus on self is where the ostrich sits. The high focus on self is where the woodpecker sits. And then on the other axis, it's focus on other. Again, the low focus being the ostrich, the high focus being the parakeet. What we mean by that is a high focus on self means a high focus or a high need to have things turn out the way I want them to turn out. In other words, I strongly believe that I am in the right when it comes to this conflict, so it better turn out my way. On the focus of other, it's more about maintaining the relationship. I believe the relationship is the most significant. And so whatever outcome in this conflict, I want to make sure we still have a relationship in the end. So those are those two axis points. The woodpecker is the style that is totally focused on self, getting things done my way, and zero focus on the other, and which means on the relationship, right? So for the woodpecker, you'll see it says there, do it my way. Woodpeckers, those are those birds that are notorious for, like, they pick a spot, right? And they hammer away at that one spot. Well, that's what woodpeckers in conflict do as well. They hammer away at something until they get what they want. I hadn't seen a woodpecker in action for a while, and I'm now talking about a woodpecker as a person in conflict being a woodpecker in a while. And I came across one just last week on a flight that I was on. And this woman sitting beside me, she was a woodpecker. So I guess she and her husband, for whatever reason, I don't know. I surmise that they hadn't checked in on time or whatever. Anyway, they didn't get seated together, and her husband got seated way towards the back of the plane. And once everybody was about seated, right in the row, like 2 rows in front of us, there appeared to be an empty seat. And so she immediately started ringing the flight attendant and said, I want my husband to sit there. And the flight attendant said, we can't deal with that right now. We're just getting everybody settled. We'll talk to you about it later. Wasn't too much longer. She rings it again. I want my husband to sit there. And she did that about 3 or 4 times, at which point the flight attendant told her, no, your husband can't move. And then she stood up and she got about this far from his face, and said, I demand, and I want to speak to your supervisor. And she got quite loud. And the supervisor came and said, sorry, ma'am, we cannot move your husband. And she got quite upset. She did sit down, but about 5 minutes later, all of a sudden she asks, can I move out of the way so she can get up? And I see she's walking to the flight attendant that's at the front of the galley. And I see her again, shaking her finger at him, clearly talking about it. Long and short of it, before the end of the flight, guess where her husband was sitting? In that seat, 2 rows in front of us. She hammered away and got what she wanted. That's a woodpecker. Okay. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got parakeets. Remember, they're on that spectrum of focus on others. So they're really concerned about the relationship, not so concerned about getting things done their way. And so the parakeet in conflict is the one who's the most likely to give in and say, okay, do it your way. This is clearly more important to you than it is to me. You know, this is, you know, we don't want to make too big a deal out of this. Are we still okay at the end of this? I just, you know, I just don't want to get too up, you know, and get anybody too upset, too riled about it. We'll just give in. That's the parakeet. Now, again, just like the woodpecker, the parakeet, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there could be a time and a place for either one of those. Now, you know, was this plane and the woman getting the seat for her husband, was that the right place for a woodpecker? Maybe, maybe not. You know, I don't know why it was that he needed to sit there specifically. Maybe there was a really important reason. But with woodpeckers, there can be a really good use of that woodpecker style. You know, I often say Mother Teresa was a woodpecker when it came to dealing with poverty. Like, she was not going to let anything go. She would continue to work on that issue and work on people to agree with her, to get it her way, to get things done. That's good use of being a woodpecker. There's a time and a place to be a parakeet. You know, sometimes it really isn't that important, and it is more important that we just get along. And so give in and move on. But there are also issues if we take on any of those approaches all the time. If you're always a woodpecker, guess what? Nobody wants to have anything to do with you after a while, you know, because you haven't done anything to build a relationship. And the interesting thing is, with the parakeet, if you're always a parakeet, you actually also destroy your relationships. Because if you're always the one giving in, there's no reciprocity in that relationship, right? So none of them work all the time, and all of them work some of the time. Now, the owl, you'll see, high focus on self. In other words, high focus on getting the right solution to the problem, but also high focus on other. So high focus on maintaining the relationship. So the owl approach is the one that wants to talk everything through, get everything addressed, get everything out on the table, work through all the issues, figure it all out, come up with a solution that works for everybody involved. Sounds good, right? Sounds like that's the way we should deal with conflict. And a lot of people think that, you know, it should always be the owl approach. But there's a problem with the owl approach as well. And the problem is that those people who are owls in conflict are so focused on the need for process and working it all out and talking it all through that it can actually become manipulative and feel manipulative, that you know, that they're insisting on something that the other party doesn't want. And I'll give you an example. So, and this is a work example, not a Rotary example, but I was dealing with two parties that were in conflict, and working with the two of them. And one was clearly an owl, the other clearly not. In fact, the other really was having a hard time talking about the conflict. And so when I brought them together, the owl starts talking, going, well, so this is how I see it, and this is how it's impacted me, and this is my perspective. And very eloquent in how he expressed himself and what he had to say. And then the other person was their turn, and they were very hesitant and didn't say too much. And then they were done. And the owl said, well, so my response to that is, and went on and started talking. And then they said, and probably your response to me would be this and this and this. So then I would say to you this and this and this, in which case you probably would respond by doing this and this and this. They were having the conversation all by themselves, right? The other party wasn't participating anymore. They were just sitting there being quiet. And this person who's the owl was, you know, here's what I think, and then you probably think this. And so then I say this, and then you'd probably say this. And they were making up the conversation all by themselves, just because they so badly needed that dialogue and that back and forth. And the one party is sitting there just looking at that going, What is this? I didn't say any of that. And you're just manipulating this whole thing for your own sake. So the owl can come across as manipulative. The other thing is, it's also time consuming, right? To really talk it all out, hash it all out, can be really time consuming. So when is it worth it to take that time? You know, if in Rotary, if you've got a conflict in your club and it potentially could mean the demise of the club, yeah, time and place for using that owl approach. Take the time. It's worth the time. You know, if it's a much simpler disagreement and, you know, it's just not worth the effort, they're not all worth hashing it all through, getting everybody involved, getting every perspective. Not every conflict is worth that. And so that time element is something to consider with the owl. And then the ostrich, you know, what do we know ostriches for? It's digging their head in the sand, right? The ostrich approach is to just ignore or deny that conflict exists. They just do not want to acknowledge it at all. It's not like the parakeet. The parakeet will acknowledge that conflict exists, but then give in. The ostrich will just deny that it's there. And I do remember years ago doing a session at a pets training and talking about conflict, and it was in person, and so all of the president-elects were standing up, and I said to them, remain standing if you have never experienced conflict in your club. Remain standing. And there was one person that stayed standing at that point. And everybody looked at him and all agreed he was probably an ostrich who simply was not acknowledging that conflict existed, right? We did it in a kind way. It was not, we were not nasty to him or anything like that. It was a fun little exercise. But it's that reminder that ostriches often just deny that it exists, and because they deny it exists, they don't do anything about it. And that's why they're sitting in that corner of low focus on self and other. It appears by their lack of engagement in any way, shape, or form that they are neither concerned about getting things done their way, nor are they concerned about preserving a relationship. And then you've got in the middle the hummingbirds. And the hummingbirds are all about being able to move and negotiate and come up with a fix and do it quickly. Just like hummingbirds move around and flit around and keep moving in different directions, the same happens in conflict. People who are hummingbirds in conflict want to keep moving around. They want to find a solution. If you give a little, I'll give a little. We'll find a good place in the middle and we'll call it done. Okay, we'll keep moving on. Let's not take a lot of time with this. And again, is there a time and place for that? Absolutely. Remember when I said sometimes for the owl, it's not worth all the time and effort? Maybe it's more a hummingbird approach that makes sense at that time. And the reverse can be true too. Sometimes it would be worth taking more time because the hummingbird approach is kind of a band-aid thing, and it might fix it short term, but it won't fix it long term at all. So I've gotten through them kind of quickly, but what do you think? Where do you sit on that scale between these different types? Oops, sorry, I'm going to go back. And I'm curious, just really quickly in the chat, can you just put in there which style you think is your most preferred style that you use the most often? Woodpecker, owl, hummingbird, parakeet, ostrich, where do you think you fit? Just real quick. Let's see what we got. He says owl, I hope. Okay, so we got some owls, we got some hummingbirds, got some parakeets. Nobody wants to acknowledge they're an ostrich. I know. Every time I ask this question, nobody puts ostrich down because the ostrich would never acknowledge that they're an ostrich. So that's why. But okay, so we've got a bit of Somebody's willing to acknowledge they're a bit of a woodpecker. Yes, and Larry, you're right. It can depend on the situation. It's not all the same all the time. You are right. We just tend to have more of one thing than the other. So yeah, so thank you. Thank you for playing along with that and joining in there a little bit. But you get the sense. And as I said, I invite you to think about your club and where your club sits as well. Do you have a lot of woodpeckers in your club? Do you have a lot of other owls in your club? If you have a lot of owls in your club, some of those meetings can get awfully long as you work through issues. If you've got a lot of parakeets in the club, you may be going around and around issues and we're going to go, oh, you have a problem? No, what about you? No, you do it the way you want to do it. That's okay. And a lot of giving in kind of thing. So it's interesting to see how that impacts how conflict is dealt with in your club. And again, as I said before, there's no right way. There's no one way that you should always address conflict. In the end, we want to be able to be flexible and use them as appropriate and recognize that sometimes, in fact, the way we approach conflict is as important as the conflict itself. So, for example, two woodpeckers in conflict, hammering away at each other, each determined to beat the other one and get it their way, can be awfully destructive. Two owls together can be long and time consuming. But just using this as an example, you have a conflict between a woodpecker and a parakeet style, and the woodpecker says, do it this way. Guess what the parakeet's going to say? Okay, right? They're more likely to give in quickly. And so, is that always the best solution? Again, it depends on the conflict, depends on the situation, but that is the pattern that will result between a woodpecker and a parakeet. So they're all different depending on these combinations. And I won't take time tonight, obviously, to go through all those possible combinations, but just to get you thinking about the different approaches and the different ways that people go at conflict and how that can impact. Now, I want to get to a couple of tips and things to think about when it comes to conflict. And that is that there is a difference between what people say and why they are saying it. And that is about interests and needs. And so you see there, the diagram, they're sort of like, icebergs, and the tip of the iceberg is the position. Underneath that are the interests and the needs. This is the challenge. Anytime we have a difficult person in our club or a difficult situation that causes some emotional statements of some sort, chances are those statements are positions, as it says there on the slide, what we say we want. But what we say we want usually comes from what we really need or what we really want, and what we really need or what we really must have. And I've given you an example there that I've seen happen in Rotary many times. So the position, the statement, I'm leaving this club. I'm upset, I'm angry, whatever. That's, final straw, I'm leaving. That's a position. That's all it is. It's a position. There's something else underneath that statement. And so an interest might be, and these are just possibilities, but the person's interest might be, I want someone to tell me I'm an important part of this club. That's what they really want. And in the long run, what do they really need? They need to be a part of a caring community that accepts and values me for who I am. Okay? That's what's underneath the I'm leaving this club. So when we have those kind of definitive, emotional kind of statements like I'm leaving this club, if we want to resolve it, we need to dig a little deeper and start finding out what's underneath. What are the interests and the needs underneath? And when we talk about interests and needs, we always talk about what's the why. I'm leaving this club. Why? What's the why? The only problem with talking about what's the why is that if you just ask why, you often make people really defensive. So I'm leaving this club, or I'm not going to do that anymore. Or I'm not going to chair that fundraiser anymore. If you just go, why? You might not get to hear about the interests and the needs. You might just make them overly defensive. And so we sometimes have to be careful about how we ask to find out about interests and needs. And so you might have to talk more about what they're concerned about, or what they're hoping for, or what their priorities are, or what their expectations are. So I'm leaving this club. Instead of just saying, well, why? Maybe you might instead ask, well, what are your expectations of the club? What expectations didn't get met for you? That will generate more information about their interests and their needs, rather than just asking them why. Because as I said, they can get overly defensive there. But it does become very important, if you want to really resolve it, to move beyond positions. So, as I was saying, if that conflict is still, at that more personalized stage, it hasn't escalated too far, and you've got people who are hopefully ready to talk it through, this becomes really important. Then how do you find out what's going on underneath? All right. So finally, some things to remember. And if you forget all the other, theoretical things I told you before, remember these. Don't make any assumptions. There's so many times when conflicts are not what they seem on the surface. Goes to what I just said about people's interests and needs underneath. They say one thing, it may not actually be what's at the heart of this. So don't start off with assumptions that you know what's going on. Even if you have been in your club for 50 years and you figure you know everybody in there really, really well, don't make assumptions if a conflict arises. Be curious. Curiosity is so much the key to resolving conflict. And I mean true curiosity, not fake. But if you can actually say, I really want to understand where this person's coming from, why they see things the way they see them, why they don't like what they don't like, or they do like what they do like. I really want to understand that. I really want to know. I'm really curious about it. That will go a long way into finding out what their interests and needs are, into working through those differences in terms of styles, getting to the root and the heart of the conflict, and being able to address it. And then, of course, listen to understand. So listening for listening's sake, yeah, it's good, but you want to listen to really understand what's really going on there. Again, it all fits in with the curiosity. What are the real interests going in? The other thing, and this is more Rotary specific, is it's important to remember that bringing it out in the open doesn't make it worse. I have found in my experience so often Rotarians are hesitant to acknowledge or address conflict because they go, we're Rotarians here. This shouldn't be happening. And if I acknowledge that there's conflict in my club, then it maybe looks like I'm not really a good president, or we're not really a good club. In fact, if you are a club that has conflict and you can bring it out and you can resolve it and can deal with it, you will be a stronger club for it. So it doesn't make the situation worse. It doesn't make you a weak club. It doesn't make you a weak president. It's important to bring it out and address it It gives everyone in your club better skills, better understanding, better communication. It is worth it in the end. The other is that your role as president is not to decide who is right and who is wrong. That is not your job. If you are working at resolving a conflict, it is not about you being judge and jury and deciding it's going to be this way, it's not going to be that way. If you really want to resolve a conflict, it's about listening to both parties and letting them come up with a solution, letting them figure it out. And, that goes for whether the conflict is between two individuals or whether it's between everyone in the club. If you come down and say, okay, I'm the club president, so I decide, you won't get buy-in. Okay? They need to be a part of the solution because they were part of the problem. And so it is your job to facilitate the opportunity to work it through, to have the dialogue, to bring it out and address it, not your responsibility to come up with the solution. And hopefully that relieves some people. It may frustrate others because some of us would like to just say, I've got the answer, just do it this way. But in the end, that is not going to be what is the most helpful to your club. So I have talked for a very long time, and we're getting closer and closer to our 8 o'clock mark. So I would like to know, are there specific questions people have, or would you prefer I can show you, we can look at these case studies a little bit and talk them through and see how some of this applies to that? I'm open, but if people have questions, now would be the time. I see Robert's hand. I don't see everybody. Maybe I will stop sharing for a minute and that might help. All right. Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
And may reflect the generation I'm coming from, which didn't use email all the time. But I have a real concern when the only way that someone communicates with either a part of a club or with oneself is email. That if you're going to resolve an issue, you need to talk person to person. And and maybe there's certain people from a certain generation I deal with everything by email. My fear is that people tend to say on email rougher things that they would say to you face to face. And so I would say, if you're going to resolve issues, try to do it face to face.
Yeah. And I'd agree with you. And you're right. It's a generational thing. Sometimes it's even just a personality thing in terms of people's reliance on email or comfort there. But we do say things differently in writing than we do in person. And conflict becomes a personal thing. So it makes sense. I saw Monica's hand and then George. So go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, well, actually, Robert, when you said what you said, I agree with that 100%. The fact that people are just emailing is just ridiculous because they expect you to answer immediately, even though they're the morning person and you're the night person, and you may not even look at your computer until 8 o'clock at night. And then you go, well, can I call them? They're already sleeping. So bottom line is, I wasn't going to talk about that, but I agree with that. But the other thing is, we did have a conflict in our club, and to his credit, our president had a meeting. We had to do it on Zoom because we couldn't get together, but we talked it out in such a way that, myself included, every one of us was furious about something. And it was, each one had a different fury about something different. And in the end, he was able to put it into perspective to say, like this person, you were talking about the woodpecker, this person is highly intelligent and has great ideas and gets so enthusiastic that he forgets that there's some of us who want to hear the details in a little more perspective, so that we say, well, what can I expect from this? Or in my case, I'm the treasurer. what do I need? Documents. I need documents. Why haven't you given me documents? So it was like the funniest thing that this conversation is taking place today, and this event happened less than 2 weeks ago. And
Wow.
I'm like blown away, because in the end, every one of us sort of like took a deep breath, and we resolved what we were going to do out loud to each other. I'm going to send you a note. I'm going to send you a copy of this. I'm going to do this thing that I should have done 3 months ago. I was procrastinating. And everything they were saying drove one person crazier than somebody else, but we
Wow.
were all really angry. And he fixed it in one meeting. And by the way,
Wow.
the meeting only lasted an hour. It was
Excellent.
mind-blowing.
Excellent. And as I say, and your club will be the stronger for having had.
Oh, we
That
feel great about
conversation.
ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
the other thing you mentioned was listening. Because
Yeah.
every person I know, myself included, we're already planning what we're going to say while the other person's talking. And
Yeah.
I heard this guy on CNN who was interviewing somebody, and he literally waited for the person to say everything. And then he took a breath, and then he went on to the next thing. And
Excellent.
again, unbelievable.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Said enough.
Thank you, Monica. Appreciate that. Yeah, George, go ahead.
Yeah, Gail, thank you so much, for sharing these insights. This has been really very helpful for me as somebody who is coming in. I'm not a veteran in Rotary. I joined Rotary in 2018, but I love what Rotary is doing, and that's why I'm jumping into the presidency. Now, listening to you and how valuable this information is, it just got me thinking, have you considered, or rather, is this maybe I'm asking something that's already practiced, sharing this kind of presentation with the entire membership of a club, as opposed to just the the presidents of the club? Because I think the entire membership of any club would benefit from these insights that you have shared.
Yeah, well, I always hesitate to say this because I don't want to suddenly have 70 presentations to clubs, but at the same time, yeah, if you want a presentation to your club at some point, a lot of times, because club meetings have to be short, a lot of times I'll just present the birds to them and just talk about the different approaches to conflict or something like that, and it can be a fun presentation and valuable to a club for sure. So always open to that invitation.
Great, thank you.
Are there other hands or comments or questions about any of that?
Iman, you're muted.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Could we listen to some of your case histories? Because we can
Yes.
learn.
Sure. Let me share my screen again, and I'll give you an example. Sorry, I just gotta rearrange things here. And there we go. Oh, that's right. Back. I'll show you case study number 1. And again, these are based on real examples and real things that have happened. So you're relatively new to Rotary and excited to be an incoming president, but you can already see potential conflict with one club member. She's a past district governor and is quite critical, constantly reminding everyone about the Rotary International rules and regulations. Some members have even threatened to leave the club because of her. So, short and sweet, but just based on our conversation, first of all, what type of a conflict, what zone of conflict is this? Is it structural? Is it systemic? Is it perceptual? Is it positional? Is it relational? Where do you think it fits? Anybody? Where do you think that fits?
Maybe multiple, relational, maybe multiple, relational, positional.
Yeah, so it can be more than one.
And
More than one, for sure. So yeah, there could be some positional if she's telling them here are the rules and regulations, and she has one interpretation of those and other people may have another. So that can be positional. It can be even structural if she's saying, look, you know, you have to do something about the structure because of these rules and regulations. So it could be that. But clearly there's a relational issue that has to do with just the kind of person she is and the way that she's approaching it. And there may be also some, you know, just some misunderstanding that she's not realizing the impact of her words or her actions and the way that they're coming across, right? So that it may be that as well. But predominantly, I would look at that and I go, you know, predominantly, probably a relational issue. Probably has had, you know, pieces and all the rest, but largely that. In terms of escalation, you've got some members that have threatened to leave the club. So it doesn't say that anybody has left yet, but you've got threats. So it isn't to the point of polarization yet, but it's kind of pushing the envelope there, right? And it's escalating fast. So if that's the case, first and foremost, oh, maybe I'll add too, let's talk about how they're approaching conflict. Okay, she's quite critical, constantly reminding everyone about the Rotary International rules and regulations. What does that sound like? Just that quick description. Kind of a woodpecker. Anybody see that there? Right, so you might be feeling like that person's kind of a woodpecker.
Yes.
So in this case, a couple things to think about. One is that this person, doesn't matter that she's a past district governor. There's going to need to be some conversation about the impact of her behavior, of the way that she comes across, right? And is that the kind of relationship that you want to have going on in the club, that people feel criticized, feel that she's constantly telling them when they're wrong, that they, you know, that they're threatening to leave the club because of her? Is this the kind of relationship and situation that you want in your club? I would hazard to guess that none of you would say, oh yeah, I want that in my club, right? That's not the way we want it to be. That's not the kind of relationships we want to have. But then you think about, okay, this person's kind of operating like a woodpecker. So how do I deal with a woodpecker in this case? Because it's not going to be enough to just say, hey, just wanted to let you know, you know, you're kind of upsetting a few folks around here. Probably not going to do it.
an owl.
Yeah, yeah, the owl approach might be required for sure. And what's interesting about woodpeckers is that there has to be reason for their behavior to change. You know, the only way, and I always tell people, the only way anybody makes change is when their style doesn't work for them anymore. So if somebody's being a woodpecker and as a result, everybody's doing as they say, in other words, if they win in the end, why would they stop being a woodpecker? Right? Why would they? Just because you say they should? Why would they?
I'm also wondering if this person is a past district governor, and this
Yeah.
is and it's coming from a period of past. And of course, Rotary is always changing. And if this person is reflecting attitudes and styles of the old rules and regulations that are not appropriate today, then you need someone to challenge that and
Yeah.
say, hey, here is the rule. It'd be just as good about the rules as this person say, this is what the rules are. Because I sense there are people who say, well, in my day, but Rotary is always changing.
Yep, Absolutely. And with woodpeckers, and I say this cautiously, because it's something you have to be careful about. But in the end, the only way to get a woodpecker to move, like I said, is when that woodpecker style doesn't work for them anymore. And generally it's because somebody else is being a woodpecker back, right? And then they suddenly go, oh, okay, they can't win. So, and again, wasn't exactly the same situation, but I was in a Rotary meeting not long ago, not a club meeting, but at another level. And we did have somebody saying, well, this has to be this, and this has to be this, and this has to be this. And I looked and I said, no, it doesn't. And I said, yeah, Rotary International says it has to be this way and this way and this way. I said, no, it doesn't. And I probably was a little quieter a woodpecker, not much, but I didn't give in. I didn't, no, doesn't have to. And then I say, here's why I know it doesn't have to be that way. Because I know this, and I know this, and I know this, and I know this, and it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, most of the time it's like this. And I know in this district they do this, and I know in this district they do this, and I know in this district they do that. I was doing the woodpecker thing right back at her.
That was good.
Now, the difference is I knew what I was doing, right? I did it intentionally. I am not a woodpecker by nature. I don't do it on a regular basis, but in that particular context, I knew that it would impact her behavior. So as I say it cautiously, because I don't want us suddenly all to become woodpeckers thinking that's the only way to get things done. That's not what I'm saying here. But sometimes when you have one person wreaking havoc, pushing back is important.
I just have one comment about that person. I think that person is exceptionally proud of what he or she has been doing in the past and is reflecting on so much fabulousness without remembering that there are a lot of new people that don't know him or her, don't have anything to compare it to. So it's like saying, well, you know, I was King of England, and you're going, huh? So I believe that this person means really well, and that's why I thought it was perceptional too, perceptive or whatever. Because
Perceptual, yeah.
Perceptual, because people are perceiving her or him as the pompous ass, when really it's just somebody who's so proud and has done so much for Rotary. So I think it's a balance from our point of view.
Absolutely. And I appreciate what you're saying as well. And it's why I call the whole thing When Good People Disagree, right? Because people are not coming to Rotary saying, I'm going to get one over on them and I'm going to wreak havoc in this club and I'm going to make people miserable. Nobody's coming to Rotary with that intent. We're coming with the best of intent.
Yeah.
We just sometimes forget that in the mix, right? So thank you for that. I'm looking at the time. I know it's 8 o'clock. I know I could talk about that frequently. I'm just looking in the chat. Is there anything else I need to respond to? Steve asked if I'm ever down in southern Ontario periodically. Yeah, I am. Never know when that could work out. So it's easy to get a hold of me. By all means, reach out and we can talk. Other than that, I think at this point, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go over time. I want to thank you all for being here, for listening, for participating. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you this evening and talk about what I think is a really important topic when it comes to Rotary. I wish you all the best in your year as presidents. Have a great year.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Gail.
Wonderful.
Gail, what's your club?
Okay.
Thank you.
Club? Gail?
My club is the Rotary Club of Orleans. Orleans, Orleans. It's the east end of Ottawa.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm.
Okay, so whoever knew that conflict had so many different facets? It certainly made us all think. I could see the heads nodding and shaking, and you guys got very actively involved. So for that, I thank you. And Gail, you did a marvelous job.
Thank you.
And as a thank you from us, we will make a $200 donation to the Rotary Foundation in your name. So
Thank you.
let's everybody give Gail a big round of applause, guys.
Thank you so much. That makes my heart happy. Thank you.
Mhm. Yes, indeed. And your husband's a past district governor, is that correct?
Yes, he's a past district governor from 7040. Yep.
Mhm. Yeah.
While you're all talking, I just wanted to mention one thing. When I first joined my club, I just joined, it was a bunch of old men who sat around talking. And I learned about them. And one day I realized that every single one of them was a director of big shots in Rotary, but they never bragged about it. No, they never. And when I became president the first year, they just said to me, you come to me anytime you need help and we'll guide you. They never demanded anything. They just more or less sort of said, you know, maybe you want to try this or maybe try that. And I was present for 3 years in a row and I used their guidance. It really, really helped. So now they want me back again.
Excellent. Excellent.
One last thing before everyone goes. You notice we recorded the session. So as a way to jog your memories, this recording will be made available. So anyone, thanks for everybody being here. It's going to end sometime. I know that a lot of you would like to stay on and talk forever, but ain't going to happen, guys. So go have a good evening. Have a glass of wine. Enjoy. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Right?